right. The title that you see on the screen is Energy Storage Examples. And that's because both of the processes that I asked you to look at last time are ways that energy can be stored. And so what I wrote over here on the side isn't necessarily new, because in Monday's class we said what the laws of thermodynamics were. Energy may be temporarily stored and given off later. It may be changed from one form to another, but it is never lost. And I want you to remember that energy doesn't go away. It might get stored, so it's not being used right at this moment in time. And that's what's happening in both photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. So the picture on the left illustrates photosynthesis, which we know quite well. The picture on the right illustrates chemosynthesis. And what I asked you to do last time was for both of them to read through page 12 and 13 of your text and to see if you could figure out what the source is, where it happens, what the reactants and products are, and what type of producer each one of them has. So I'm going to answer each of those 4 questions for you. We'll start with the source. In photosynthesis, the source of energy is the sun. Now, the sun is the original source of energy for pretty much everything on our planet. An exception to this is actually chemosynthesis. In chemosynthesis, the source is usually heat, and the heat comes from, in most cases, a geothermal vent. So you'll notice in my picture, that's illustrating something that's happening under the water. And so in chemosynthesis and photosynthesis, I have a different original energy source. That's something that's a key difference. Another thing I asked you to indicate was where it happens. And we can be pretty general here. Where it happens isn't so much a geographic place as a description of the conditions. Photosynthesis happens anywhere light is. If sunlight can get to a place, photosynthesis can happen there. Chemosynthesis happens in a place where no sunlight shows up. So a good example of a place like this is the bottom of the ocean. So I'm just going to pause here and just show you a little clip of what something that does this looks like. Anywhere that there's no sunlight, the bottom of the ocean would be a prime example, is where chemosynthesis happens. Now, if we talk about reactants and products. Now, reactants are the things that start the reaction. Products are the things that you end up with. I don't need you to memorize the whole reaction for chemosynthesis. You should already know the reaction for photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, my reactants are CO2 and water. Those are the 2 substances that I start with. In chemosynthesis, I have CO2, I have water, but I also have oxygen, and I also have hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide, it can actually be considered an acid. It has a bad smell, much like rotten eggs. If you have been in a natural hot spring and noticed that it smells like sulfur, this would generally be the reason. There's a lot of sulfur around hydrothermal vents, and hydrothermal vents are where natural hot springs are getting their heat from. So the thing that I want you to notice is the difference. For chemosynthesis, not only do I need CO2 and water, I also need a bit of oxygen, as well as hydrogen sulfide. What this means is that the products are slightly different as well. In photosynthesis, one of the goals is to produce oxygen. But in chemosynthesis, that's not the goal. In chemosynthesis, what are we going to produce? We are going to produce a carb. It doesn't necessarily have to be glucose, but some form of carbohydrate will be produced. And the reason I'm not specifying is because it depends on exactly which compounds were there to start. And another compound with sulfur that is actually an acid. So I'm not producing oxygen in chemosynthesis. That's not its goal. I am still producing a molecule that's a carbohydrate, and that is where the energy is stored. That's a molecule that organisms will use later, break down, and do cellular respiration with. Now, the last thing that I asked you was to think about what type of organism is doing this. And so that you know, a green plant is the main organism that can perform photosynthesis. There are also some algae and some bacteria that have this ability, but green plants would be the #1 source. I mentioned before, and here's the word, there are tube worms around hydrothermal vents, and on those tube worms are generally little bacteria that are going to perform this process. So the key difference, plants don't do chemosynthesis. Bacteria can do both, but plants, green plants, only do photosynthesis. Now, up until here, would anybody like to ask any questions about the difference between the two? Now, if you have the printed notes, you'll see that I wrote basically all of this stuff underneath. I just want to mention this one last point right here. For producers, like green plants, they're only actually using 1, maybe 2% of the sun's total energy. But they can produce tons and tons and tons of organic matter every year. And so this process that's essential to life isn't even using all of the sun's energy. Lots of the sun's energy is being used for other things, like warming the planet and creating wind and creating waves. Only a small fraction of it is actually being used to do photosynthesis. So a lot of you, as I suspected, already know what goes in a food chain. So what we're going to do here is summarize, starting with photosynthesis or starting with chemosynthesis, where does energy go, either starting from the sun or starting from those hydrothermal vents. So if I could summarize what's happening, both of those processes, photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, both store energy in a chemical molecule. They are both producing a carb. Now we know what carbs are used for. A carbohydrate will be digested and eventually give you glucose. And glucose is what cell respiration uses to provide energy. So in cell respiration, that carbohydrate and oxygen will produce CO2, H2O, and energy. And energy is what we're focused on, because that's our topic, is where is energy going. So whether it started with the sun or with a chemical molecule or with a chemical, photosynthesis and chemosynthesis are both storing energy in a molecule. The molecule is a carb. In cell respiration, that carb plus oxygen for living organisms will produce CO2, H2O, and of course ATP. Now this energy, this ATP, is used to do cellular processes. So in any living organism, whether it has one cell or many cells, there are processes that need to happen. So I'll just give you a few examples. Digestion, excretion, respiration, circulation, contractions. Perhaps you can see that what I did there was make a list of the 5 systems that we just studied to show you that for any of those things to happen, you need cellular energy. Now we also know that the waste products of cellular respiration are reused as the reactants of photosynthesis. So don't forget that this is a cycle. It doesn't just end. As soon as I'm done one process, I restart the other one. And so what I told you sort of near the beginning was that I can't get rid of things. I can't get rid of energy. It doesn't go away. It simply changes what form it's in. Now another waste product of cellular respiration is heat. And I'm going to mention that separately. Cellular respiration, like a lot of other chemical reactions, will produce a bit of heat. Now this heat could be useful. For example, when you shiver, your heat is useful. It's warming you up. Your muscle contractions, because of cellular respiration, are producing heat, and that's making you warmer. But sometimes heat is not useful energy. And so I just want to point out it can be useful or it can be unusable to the living organism who produced it. It all depends on what their temperature is when they perform cell respiration. So if I wanted to summarize where does energy go in a photosynthetic environment, I would start with the sun. Visible light that we can see with our eyes, that's the type of light we're talking about. It continues through plants to animals and finishes with decomposers. So I asked you guys to think about what belongs in a food chain. A plant would be considered a producer. Animals are considered consumers. Now, a few people mentioned specific types of consumers, herbivore, a carnivore, an omnivore. That's a way that you can categorize them. Other ways that you can categorize them are just by which level they're on. You could say a first, a second, or a third order consumer, depending on how high they are in the food chain. And we're going to make a list in our class probably tomorrow of all of the different ways that you can describe these parts of the food chain. If we start with a deep sea vent, energy flow starts with thermal energy from the water. And like I mentioned, that's produced by nuclear reactions that are happening in the center of the Earth or in the Earth's crust. It passes on to bacteria and protozoa. Protozoa are small single-celled organisms that if you didn't look closely you would think was maybe just another bacteria. To animals and then to decomposers. So they both have the same parts in their food chain. It's simply that in a photosynthetic environment, the producer is usually a plant. The producer, don't forget, is a bacteria in the chemosynthetic environment. And the way to tell which one of them is going to happen is all based on light intensity. The more light intensity, the higher the rate of photosynthesis. And this will increase the amount of energy plants will store.